Peterhof. The name Peterhof in German means Petrov, and Peterhof was created in the first quarter of the 18th century, according to the plan of Peter the Great, as a ceremonial royal summer residence, and the residence was arranged quickly. In 1714th year, construction began. On the 15th of August 1723rd year was the grand opening of Peterhof, and, of course, the main building of the Peterhof Cathedral is the Grand Peterhof Palace, and we will come to the stand with you. The stand here presents the history of the creation of the Great Peterhof Palace. Yes, anyone who wishes can sit on the bench, please. Yes, but under Peter the Great, the palace was not large. It was the upper chambers, a modest two-story building, tires only 42 meters. In fact, the width of the Highland chambers was equal to the width of the Grand Cascade, which, at Peter's request, was arranged on a kind of pedestal in the Highland tents. The Highland chambers were built on the basis of a schematic drawing by Peter himself, and under the guidance of architects Johann Bronstein, Jean-Baptiste Lejeune, and Nicola Michty. And in the 41st year of the 18th century, the daughter of Peter the Great, Elizabeth Petrovna, became empress. It needs the scope of luxury, and by the decree of Elizabeth Petrovna, the Great Peterhof Palace is being rebuilt by the outstanding architect Francesco Bartonio Rastrel. Elizabeth Petrovna set one condition for the architect. It was necessary to keep the Middle Petrovsky part of the palace unchanged. What should a firing squad do? Firstly, he changes the scale of the building, deploying it along the ledge by almost 300 meters. He extends the rub on one floor of the Middle Petrovskaya part of the prince, both sides of the stone gallery, and the gallery to complete the pavilions. On the eastern side, the church building, which became the palace church of the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and on the western side, the building under the coat of arms. The body under the coat of arms is crowned with a weather vane in the form of a three-headed eagle under the imperial crown. Previously, it was intended for the residence of high-ranking guests of the Peterhof residence, as well as for younger members of the imperial family. And now there is a special storeroom museum in the building, and a special storeroom museum exhibits a work of decorative, applied and jewelry art of the 17th, early 20th century, and many of these works have a memorial character. Well, before the events of the October Revolution of 1917th year, the Grand Peterhof Palace was the main palace of the summer pirate residence, and balls, masquerades, diplomatic receptions, as well as ceremonial dinners were held in the halls of the palace. In the photo you can see the gala dinner in honor of the arrival of the French President Felix in Peterhof in 1897th year. But now we are going to come to the other side of the stand for a moment, and see what was already in the 20th century. After the October Revolution of 1917, Peterhof was analyzed. The Grand Palace has received the status of a historical and art museum, and the museum life of the palace begins, and the first tour takes place. The first tour of the palace took place in May 1918th year. Well, during the Second World War, unfortunately, Peterhof suffered a lot. For almost 2.5 years, from September 23rd of the 41st to January 19th, the 44th, was in Peterhof in the zone of Nazi occupation. Unfortunately, the palaces and parks of Peterhof received very serious destruction, and the Great Peterhof Palace, as you can see in these photos, was almost destroyed. That is, 90% of the building was destroyed. The central, Petrovsky part of the palace was particularly badly damaged, and 4,000 museum exhibits, which were in the palace before the war, managed to evacuate a little more than half to the city of Leningrad, to the Siberian Serapol. In Leningrad, for example, the exhibits were stored in the basement of St. Isaac's Cathedral, but in 1948th year, despite such severe destruction of the building, they still decided to recreate the palace. And the reconstruction, according to the project of Leningrad architects Evgenia Kazanskaya and Vasily Sovkov. And 10 years later, in 1958, the facade of the palace was realized, and in 1964, 4 conscious interiors were opened for the guests of Peterhof. Today, we will see in 20 conscious interiors of the Grand Peterhof Palace. Let's start our acquaintance with the interiors with the grand staircase. Dear guests, here is some interior. This is just the grand staircase to 2 more Chinese offices. We inspect these interiors with you through the passage, that is, It is not recommended to stay in them. I'm going to start telling you downstairs, and then we'll slowly go up to the second floor. It is allowed to photograph you wrestlers, but please, no flash. Bad, right? Do you hear? So, and now, better, all right. And before going up the grand staircase, I want to draw your attention to the magnificent sculptures of the beginning of the 18th century. These are Adam and Eve. They were dropped by the Venetian sculptor Giovanni Benassa. And these sculptures of tribal fountains in the lower park. In the park there are replicas of artificial marble, and authentic sculptures of the early 18th century are here in front of you, in the Grand Peterhof Palace. Well, for sure, dear guests, you all know that first of all Peterhof has its fountains, and Peterhof fountains are unique in that they have been working without a single gravity pump for more than 300 years. This is a unique natural system, and Anton Peterhof spends more than 1,000 liters of water in just 1 second. Well, pay attention also to the layout of the Grand Peterhof Palace. Now we are in the western wing on the right, and we will pass the middle part of the palace, the so-called enfilade, that is, it is a series of halls, the doors of which are on the same axis, and the length of the suite in the palace is about 200 meters. Well, we will slowly climb the grand staircase with you now. When climbing, take your time. Be careful. Parquet floors, shoe covers are quite slippery. Yes, but earlier, by the way, people went to visit the palace from the upper garden. There are doors behind you, and through these doors, guests entered the palace, and from the first step of the stairs, created the impression of wealth and luxury. Well, let's go up with you slowly. Well, the grand staircase precedes the second main floor of the palace and presents a very bright contrast compared to the lobby. To decorate the grand staircase, architect Francesco Bartoni shot in the Baroque style, and the main cop brass, decorative wooden latched carving. The cut of the toe is very diverse. There are paintings on the walls. The painting also imitates wooden carvings. The artificially painted niches depict figures of the goddess of the lunar universe, the sun god and patron of the Musa Apollo, as well as the goddess of the forest fleet, on the railing of vases. So, dear guests, we are with you in the dance hall. This is one of the brightest, most brilliant interiors of the Grand Peterhof Palace. The dance hall was also decorated by the architect of the Chechen Schott in the Baroque style. The very term Baroque in Italian means bizarre or strange. Translated from Portuguese, the first Baroque is a pearl of irregular shape, and this style dominated the reign of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna in Russia, was called Elizabethan or Russian Baroque. This style is characterized by an abundance of wood-patched carvings, bright painting of ceiling lights, set parquet floors, but also, of course, numerous mirrors. The area of the dance hall is about 200 square meters, but the space is expanded precisely due to numerous large mirrors, as well as due to false mirrored windows that reflect the view from real windows. This is a view of the upper garden. The ceiling is decorated with a huge picturesque ceiling light. This is a ceiling lamp on the theme of Parnassus, and its plot is the language of the filigree symbol. The language of the filigree symbol, of course, was very characteristic of the art of the 18th century, and glorifies the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna as the patroness of the arts, science, Remesia. Here, in the very center of the ceiling, was depicted a juicy light Apollo. Apollo is located on Mount Parnassus, surrounded by 9 beautiful muses. Just above the winged horse Pegasus, a hoof-flowing spring, poets drew inspiration from this source. And in the clouds, the order of the goddess of victory Victoria is also the goddess of wisdom Minerva, and the composition is crowned by a female figure with a scepter in her hand. This is the goddess Juno. The analysis loses the Russian Empire, as well as the ruler of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Initially, the ceiling was painted in the middle of the 18th century by the Venetian painter Bortovaya Tarsi, but, unfortunately, the original ceiling was lost and realized by restorers from pre-war black and white photographs, as well as from 2 surviving sketches by the artist La Tarse. Well, along the perimeter of the hall, above the mirrors, there are integral picturesque compositions of metal ones. They were painted by Italian artists, theater decorator Giuseppe Valerianina, plots from ancient literary works of Virgil's Aeneid, and metamorphoses about the species. The characters are the heroes of ancient myths. The dance hall, lit by many candles, bronze wall lamps, of course, was a luxurious backdrop for balls and masquerades. Masquerade balls are especially common here and were held during the reign of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Elizabeth Petrovna herself, of course, also shone at balls. She had a beautiful grace, was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time. Her beauty was even called Venus, and Elizabeth Petrovna loved to appear at masquerades in a man's suit, which she perfectly sat on. She was very fond of building so-called metamorphoses, that is, the cavaliers changed into ladies' dress, and yes, we respectively in a man's suit. But it is known that the Empress' passion for clothes. Elizabeth Petrovna did not appear in the same dress twice, that is, she did not wear almost the same dress twice, and according to legend after her death, more than 15,000 dresses, 2,000 pairs, and 2 chests of silk stockings were found in her wardrobe. But to this day, only one empress dress has survived, the coronation one. It is now in Moscow, in the armory. Nyuta Petrovna was also very pious, but this character was combined with a passion for entertainment. She could, for example, go to the bazaar after the evening service, keep up with the balls in the morning, and the presence of a temple in the immediate vicinity of the palace, of course, for the empress was very important spiritual needs. Of course, it was also very convenient. But we will slowly go through the next interior with you, which is called the Chesmensky Hall.
Yeah. Here, this one.
In the middle of the 18th century, under the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, the interior, of course, was also decorated in a magnificent threshold style. But at first the interior was called the anteroom because it precedes the main hall of the palace, the throne, and in the anteroom during the receptions, the ceremony was officially expected to begin. In the era of the administration of Empress Katerina II, the Baroque style goes out of fashion, replaced by the Latin style of classicism. Classic, which means exemplary, and the main element of the decor is elegantly stucco compositions, and also the role of painting in creating a repeatable interior is enhanced. 12 paintings adorn the walls. The canvases are all authentic. They were painted by the German artist Jacob Philipp Hacker. These canvases depict various episodes from the Russian-Turkish War, and 6 of the cobwebs are dedicated to the Battle of Chesma, which took place on the night of June 25th to 26th, 1770. Well, for example, dear guests, pay attention to the canvas on the western wall at the top left. But the canvas there depicts the landing of the Turkish fleet in the Chesma Bay. Since the hacker wrote the canvases very reliably, based on the memories of the participants in the battles, when writing this canvas at the beginning, he made a number of inaccuracies because he had never seen an explosion happen on a ship, and so in order for the artist to portray the episode reliably, Catherine II steamed up to blow up one of the ships of the Russian fleet, the 60-piece frigate Saint Barbara, and on the raid of the port of Livorno-Vitali, where the Russian squadron was based, the ship was very barrels of gunpowder, and with a huge current of the Zorro family. This explosion of the ship was, of course, a sensation. Here is the German poet Goethe, who was a friend of the artist Hackert, with the inherent Moroni, said, "By far, it was the most precious model that the artist has ever served." It's hard to hear me right. Yes.
Not heard.
Is it good now? Yes. We have something with the equipment. Yes. Well, a small room is also adjacent to the Chesmensky Hall. Previously, it had an official purpose. The interior of the colored silk wall is called the Blue Reception Room. Secretaries and camera couriers were housed in the Blue Reception Room, and their duties included the introduction of special cameras Fourier magazines, in which not all events that took place in the imperial court were recorded. The door from the Blue Receiving Wind Gallery. The gallery connects the central part of the palace with the building under the coat of arms, but from the chambers of the building under the coat of arms in the 18th and 19th centuries, the highest exits began, that is, such solemn processions, families, imperial escort, a whole holy courtier, through the whole palace of the Church of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul. In other words, how did it happen? They left the rest of the building under the coat of arms, walked along the roof of the gallery, through the doors of the blue reception rooms, went to the palace, then went out to the northern front enfilade, about 200 meters long. We are also going to go out to the front enfilade now. After passing through the suite, they again went out to the gallery and entered the Church of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul. There was a service in the church. After the service, they went back in the same way to the core, under the coat of arms, and the highest exits were divided into large and small ones. The big ones took place on particularly significant church holidays, as well as solemn days. The last significant event that took place in the Church of the Holy Apostles Peter Paul was the sacrament of baptism of the long-awaited heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, the son of Emperor Nicholas II. Caesarevich Alexei was born on the 30th of July, 1904th year, and in the Church of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, he was baptized on the 11th of August. Well, dear guests, we are passing through the largest and most ceremonial hall of the Peterhof Palace. This is the throne room. Its area is more than 300 square meters. Along with the previous Chesmensky, the throne room was also redesigned by the decree of Empress Catherine II by architect Yuri Matveevich Felton in the classical style, and the electronic hall is illuminated by magnificent chandeliers, 12 chandeliers with glass pendants in the form of oak leaves. These chandeliers are authentic Russian work from the middle of the 18th century, and they come from the historical collection of the Grand Peterhof Palace. And now pay attention to the beautiful shade of glass pendants. This was achieved due to the fact that when the glass was boiled, manganese was added during cooking, and the so-called amethyst crystal was obtained. Well, the theme of naval glory also continues to sound in the throne room. Here, in the very center of the western wall, there are 4 large battle canvases by the English artist Richard Patten. These canvases are also dedicated to the Battle of Chesma. Also, and the whole appears, in order to emphasize the continuity of power. Catherine ordered to place 4 ceremonial portraits of predecessors on the Russian throne on the wall of the hall. This, of course, is a ceremonial portrait of Peter the Great, the founder of St. Petersburg and Peterhof, and on the right side is a portrait of Peter the Great's wife Catherine I, but also the first woman on the Russian throne, was crowned by Peter Catherine in 1724th year. Opposite the portrait of Catherine is a portrait of Peter the Great's niece, Empress Anna Ionovna, and on the right it is, of course, a portrait of Peter the Great's daughter, Catherine I, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. These ceremonial portraits were painted by the German artist Heinrich Goetz, but between the windows of the second tier there are small portraits of the closest relatives of Peter the Great. Here is a representative of the House of Romanov. How can it be said that the throne room is like such a kind of family album? Let's get to know you with portraits. On the south wall, there was a portrait of Peter the Great's mother, Natalia Kirillovna Narishkina, and then Peter's great-grandmother Inokine Marfa, then great-grandfather Patriarch Filaret, then a portrait of Peter I's half-sister Princess Sophia. Sophia was regent under the minor Tsars Ivan and Peter, and then a portrait of the native and beloved sister of Peter the Great, Princess Natalia. Natalia supported Petra in all her endeavors, and there is also a portrait of Peter the Great's half-brother, Tsar Fyodor III, on the south wall. On the north one, there is a portrait of Peter the Great's father, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. Then the girl is Tsarina Natalia. This is Peter I's daughter Catherine I. Natalia, unfortunately, did not live very long at all, only 4½ days. Then there is a portrait of Princess Charlotte, the wife of Peter the Great's eldest son Alexei Petrovich, and then Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich himself. But, unfortunately, Alexei Petrovich had a tragic fate. He was deprived of the heir to the throne and died in casemates. Peter and Paul Fortress in June 1718th year. Then a portrait of Peter the Great's eldest daughter Catherine I, Anna Petrovna. Anna Petrovna married Duke Holstein of Torb. His wife left for her homeland in Gdynia and became the mother of Karl Peter Ulrich, the future Emperor Peter III, but also a portrait of a baby in the image of Cupid. And this baby is the youngest son of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Peter Petrovich. His family loved him very much. They called him affectionately Shisheka. Peter had very high hopes for him. Pyotr Petrovich was the official heir to the throne, but, unfortunately, he also lived quite a bit, only about 3.5 years. Well, you and I came to the east wall of the throne room, and here on a three-stage pedestal is the throne. This is the place of the monarch during official and solemn ceremonies. The throne chair and footstool were made by Russian craftsmen in the first half of the 18th century. Carved from oak, lunges, of course, Peter the Great's favorite tree, Vyslokno, upholstered in velvet. The throne chair is also decorated with a boulder, and on the throne chair is an equestrian ceremonial portrait by the Danish artist Vigelius Eriksson. This portrait reminds us of the palace coup of June 28, 1762 year. As a result of the palace coup, Grand Duchess Ekaterina Alexeyevna, and Angeltsevskaya, a princess by birth, came to the Russian throne, on top of the string of his spouse, the law of Emperor Peter III, grandson of Peter I, and was invited by the Russian Empress Catherine II. And in this portrait, the artist depicted Ekaterina in the proud uniform of the Semenovsky regiment, and riding her favorite horse Diamonds, at the moment when Catherine, at the head of the Guards regiments, marches from St. Petersburg to Peterhof, after the invitation of her Russian empress. But the history of the palace pirates of Russia in the 18th century is the result of Peter the Great's decree on the succession to the throne. This decree abolished the custom of transferring the throne to descendants in the direct male line, and provided for the appointment of a successor at the will of the monarch himself, which significantly expanded the list of contenders for the crown. Well, as the famous historian Vasily Osipovich Klyuchevsky wrote to Ekaterina, Catherine was the last accident on the Russian throne, spent a long extraordinary reign, created an entire epoch in our history. Then there will be reigns according to the legal order, and in the spirit of established custom. Catherine came to the Russian throne when she was 33 years old. She was on the Russian throne for 34 years, but the time of her reign went down in history as the Age of Enlightenment. Yes, Catherine was a very active person, and during her 34 years of rule, she wrote more than 14,500 different decrees. Yes, but you and I, dear guests, will slowly go through the next interior in one hall. If all particularly important receptions and ceremonies took place here in the throne room, then the audience hall was mainly intended for court leisure, as well as for small audiences. Yes, well, now we're going to go in the hall for another half a minute. Yes, dear guests, but for now I want to draw your attention to the wonderful view of the woman in the basement. Yes, and in fact, it is a fragment of a chicken called Vera. But once Peter the Great ordered the Italian sculptor Antonio Caradini to sculptures Faith and Religion, and the sculptures represented two girls full length with a veil on their face. The voile motif is very common in Caradini's work. To create a veil requires a very high skill of the sculptor. Initially, sculptures of Faith and Religion decorated the summer garden in St. Petersburg, but Catherine II, during the years of her administration, she ordered to bring the sculpture from the summer garden to the Winter Palace. And now, during the reign of Emperor Nicholas I in 1837 year, a very strong fire occurred in the Winter Palace. Unfortunately, the structures were damaged in the fire. Under the name of Faith, only the upper part remained, that is, the bus. As you can see, it was repaired, and now it adorns the large Peterhof Palace, and the sculpture Religion, unfortunately, was almost lost. Well, let's go through one hall. Please come to the center of the interior. Yes, come to the important guests. There is a lot of free space, please. And as you can see, one hall, along with the grand staircase and the dance hall, is also a very striking example of the work of the architect Francesco Bartoni Rastrelli. And in this interior, the architect seems to be striving to go beyond the limits of real space, and he achieves a stunning optical effect due to the arrangement of mirrors opposite each other. And try to stand between the mirrors, look at them, and you will see an endless suite of sparkling halls in the mirrors. But this is also, of course, one of the features of the Baroque style. Here is a combination of the illusory and the real. And in the hall, there is also a very diverse stellar decor that introduces the shooting of the so-called round sculpture. Here, for example, is a path above each of these openings of the figurine, and the path holds various instruments in its hands, such as musical, navigation, gardening. This symbolizes the flourishing of arts, sciences, and crafts. And along the walls, there are console racks made by Viennese and German masters from the middle of the 18th century. There are works of porcelain on the tables. There are two paired Chinese vases in the Western country. These are vases from the middle of the 18th century. The bronze mount was added by European masters already at the beginning of the 19th century, but sculptural groups on mythological subjects are also represented on the tables, and they were made at the first European porcelain production enterprise, the Meissen Royal Porcelain Manufactory, founded in 1710th year in the city of Meissen in Saxony. The fascination with Meissen porcelain at the Russian court began under Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, and porcelain then was, of course, not only an interior decoration, but a very expensive gift. Elizabeth Petrovna gave these expensive gifts to her guests. During balls, masquerades holds lotteries, and one of the prizes in the lotteries was porcelain of Saxony. Stuffing was called porcelain, but mostly I was presented with a sculptural group in the hall, which were made according to the models of the very famous fashion designer Johann Kendler. So look with what grace they are executed. All the features of the costume of this time, and hairstyles, and even various accessories, down to the little things, such as buttons and even flies on the hood's face. The flies are artificial moles, which were cut out in style from tapta or velvet, and the ladies pasted flies on the face, or under the neckline, with figurative circumstances, but with the help of the husband's face. It was possible to communicate without words, that is, the gentleman had to understand this language of the face and the husband. The Bolshaya Petrugovsky Palace has a unique collection of not only porcelain plastics, but also famous palace sets, and we will see one of the palace sets in the White Dining Room. Yes, come in, dear guests, please. An interview. A small room adjoins the White Dining Room. Previously, it had an official purpose. This was the former heating. That is, once they warmed up and also served food here. And currently the coronation chair of Emperor Nicholas I is on display. The chair comes from the museums of the Moscow Kremlin. The coronation ceremonies of the Russian monarchs took place in the Assumption Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin. But the White Dining Room is a very striking example of a classicism-style interior. The walls are decorated with magnificent stucco compositions. The plots of these compositions emphasize the purpose of the interior. The White Dining Room is illuminated by chandeliers of Russian work of the mid-18th century. We have seen a similar chandelier in the throne room, but in the White Dining Room there is the largest chandelier of the Peterhof order, respectively the heaviest, weighing more than 500 kilograms, and it was introduced in the style, with chandeliers, decorated with girandoli as well. These are so-settlely devices, also of gilded bronze, with a glass pendant. Yes, dear guests, please do not put your hand on the string, otherwise we will have an alarm sound accompanying you. Yes, you see, these sensors are there, and they work when even a little bit of a rope is brought in. But a fan's service is on display on the table. This service was ordered by Empress Catherine II, the famous English ceramist Josie Wood. Jazz works were highly appreciated. The master became famous with the production of new types of ceramic mass, including cream-colored fans. This service was also made, and initially it consisted of about 1,500 items. But, unfortunately, a smaller part has survived to this day. Now there are about 200 items in the auction collection. But look at all the same objects, are very diverse in form, in purpose. Here, for example, is a plate at the end of a watermelon. The watermen were filled with hot water so that they cooled down very quickly. Well, there are also nipples, egg boxes, antiquities, such deep bowls with a lid for frying, and the service complements the Russian glass of the middle of the 18th century. Trophy damasks, glasses, shot glasses decorated with gilding. For example, glasses with lids were intended for hot weak drinks, such as Gwen or Grog. In the 18th century, red wine was still drunk warmed up. White wines were drunk chilled. Also in the middle of the 18th century, ice cream became a very popular delicacy on the tables of the imperial. Ice cream was served in one-piece ice cream vases, with separate ones for ice, and here are two similar ice cream vases of the late 18th century. You can also see on the table here. The central decoration of the table is an aromatic vase with a figure for poison. The vase was made in Copenhagen at the end of the 18th century, and incense was set on fire in the vase of the fragrance maker, in order to fill the room with a pleasant aroma. At the Grand Peterhof Palace, grand dinners could last for several hours, of course, and were accompanied by ceremonial dinners, of course with music, and also during ceremonial dinners a thick list of toasts was proclaimed in advance by the state, and not approved, and the main toast proclaimed health and longevity. Gastelum does not recognize this as a state crime. Along with the magnificent classicism-style interiors, two Chinese cabinets decorated with oriental motifs, designed by French architect Jean-Baptiste Valand-Lamothe, also appear at the Grand Peterhof Palace under the Empress costume too. Dear guests, I remind you that we are slowly examining Chinese objects through the passage, and when you pass, please do not approach the ropes, so that the alarm does not work. It does not distract anyone. Let's go slowly. The tiny decoration of Chinese cabinets resembles jewelry boxes. The walls are decorated with lacquer panels. The panels are painted in gold silver on a black background, and Chinese cabinets were accustomed to demonstrate a rich collection of porcelain, as well as various oriental rarities, which were of course the pride of the palaces. And at this time, Japanese and Chinese handicaps, furniture from the 17th to the 19th century, are exhibited in Chinese cabinets. And we are going through the Western Chinese cabinet, where there will also be an Eastern one, which is designed logically to the Western one, and they are located in the old Petrovsky part of the palace on both sides of the picture hall, located in the center. But the axis of this Peterhof ensemble passes through the picture hall, and, entering the interior, the view opens up here, and from the south side it is a view of the upper garden, and from the north, and of course a view of the lower park, and the sea channel, which connects to the Gulf of Sin. And the sea channel under Peter the Great, of course, was navigable. When the grand opening of the Peterhof residence took place on the 15th of August, 1723 year, more than 100 sailing ships entered the sea channel that day. In other words, the idea of Peter the Great was to make the front entrance of the residence from the seaside. That's it. And Peter conceived, yes, that is, the guests entered the sea channel. There was a harbor in the bucket of the Grand Cascade. The harbors were moored and passed through the grottos of the Grand Cascade to the upland chambers. That's literally from the cow to the ball. And when the famous Samson tearing Patreon appeared in the bucket of the cascade, it appeared under Empress Anianovna in 1735 year, but, unfortunately, since then, it has lost its navigable value, or rather the sea channel. But we are in the picture hall, and the second name of the picture hall is the Motigration Cabinet. Its main attraction, of course, are 368 submitted portraits, and the portraits were painted by only one artist. This is the court painter Italian Pietro Antonio Rotary Auto goalkeepers. You can see here on Albert. And the portraits on the hall were placed in a trellis test of solid hanging. Between them, they are only a narrow crushed baguette, and mostly young girls at the party. The girls do not know their origin. They are dressed in a variety of national costumes. Well, if you carefully, slowly examine the portraits, you can see that the faces of beautiful girls are repeated. In these portraits, the artist invented only. This is a verse of female murderers. Well, the picture hall completes the set of ceremonial halls of the Grand Peterhof Palace. On the east side, Chinese offices adjoin it in the east. It is logically decorated in the west. We also consider it cool with you. Passing by, pay attention to the oven, which is decorated with motifs, as well as parquet floors. More than 10 valuable wood species have been recruited in Chinese vase. Basically, We are walking on parquet floors made of 3 or 4 types of wood: oak, stained oak, walnut, and beech. And behind the East Chinese cabinet, the Empress's private chambers open. Dear guests, the interiors here are quite small. I'm going to ask you, please come through from the beginning of the interior. You will have to be placed a little tighter here, and also by the rope. Please do not bring your hand in. Yes, please come in. The puppy ahead. Traditionally, the complex of the Empress private chambers consisted of 4 rooms, from the boudoir, the bathroom, the toilet, and the study. Well, since the Grand Peterhof Palace performed mainly representative functions, therefore, the Empress personal rest is also included in the northern breed enfilade, and now we are in the boudoir, the very name of the boudoir of the French Buddha, which means there are goals to be naughty, and here the Empress could spend time with the most selected guests. That there was a boudoir from the Salon musical, beautiful pedal harp. This is a harp of the early 19th century. It is the people of the great Peterhof Palace, and was performed by the French harp master Sebastian Rara. Sebastian Rara's instruments had both excellent sound and excellent artistic design. Well, in the documents, the boudoir was very often referred to as the partridge drawing room according to the pattern of wall silk. Partridges are depicted in a field. Initially, Catherine II ordered the famous Lyonese weaver and artist Philippe Dallas. Silk was sold very, very expensive. They did not decorate the royal palaces of France and Europe. This is an expensive linen silk, very carefully guarded, of course, but still promised by the end of the 19th century, and was reproduced already here in Russia, on the model of the shoemaker brothers in Moscow. And during the Great Patriotic War, it was possible to preserve several meters of this ancient fabric. And the fabric here is restorers, too, on old cassock looms for the 19th century. Of course, a lot of work has been done here. The texture of the material is aware. The lagging range has more than 30 shades. Here it was the 19th century. Here, too, dear guests are represented. You see, the curtains are made of powder. It is darker, that is, it can be distinguished by its shade. But the ceremonial bedchamber, the sofa second name, continues the classic style of the Empress. On the right side, there is an alcove niche, a corner for relaxation, on both sides of the niche of the door. There are doors on the southern body, would also be the emperor's repose. We will get acquainted with the emperor of the bedchamber at the end of the tour. Yes, a sofa appeared in the ceremonial resting room of the Empress under Catherine II, which was referred to in the documents as a Turkish sofa with an attack. According to legend, the sofa was brought as a gift for Catherine II, her favorite Grigory Potemkin, and Ekaterina even wrote her impressions about this sofa, which was really unusual for that time, in a letter, and his correspondent in Paris knows the publicist Baron Grimm. Ekaterina humorously remarked in a letter that 12 people can contentedly crouch on the sofa as they please. But the dog by the sofa on a green cushion is a levretka named Zemira. This is Catherine II's favorite dog. From the place of her beloved dog Zemira, Catherine was worried hard and ordered her to perform a life-size at the Imperial Farforni factory of Alipov Zemiru by the French sculptor Jean-Dominique Rocher. The Empress of the Toilet continues to make artisanal pots. Toilet dear guests also pay attention to the show, to which the decorated wall was also moved by a subject of the late 19th century. It was woven by Kachami on the Tokura of the brothers shoemakers of Moscow. Well, the dressing of the Empress, combing, makeup were carried out in the toilet here. The Empress could not spend time in front of a mirror here either. Of course, the toilet room had to have good lighting. The magnificent chandelier is exhibited at the end of the 18th century. The chandelier is made in the Royal Meissen porcelain manufactory. So with a tabletop, a marble toilet set made of pink porcelain, but above the table there is a ceremonial portrait of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. This portrait was painted by the court artist of the French King Louis XV, Charles Vallot. But it is interesting that the artist Elizabeth Patron has never seen live. He painted the portrait according to a small miniature which was located at the French court, and according to the requirements of the ceremonial portrait, he created, of course, such a somewhat idealized image of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, at that time already a 50-year-old testament. He was a young and beautiful woman in a luxurious silk dress and with royal legals, and on the left there is a portrait of Petrovna's nephew Pyotr Fedorovich, the future Emperor Peter III, and on the right, there is a portrait of Catherine II. The portrait of Catherine was painted by a famous artist in a realistic manner. Catherine in the portrait depicts the last years of her life. She has lived 67 years, and it is known after contemporaries that Catherine spent a little time in front of the mirror, all 10 or 15 minutes personally. For example, Elizabeth Petrovna, who could spend several hours in front of the mirror. Well, the Empress's cabinet completes the complex of unnecessary shackles. The furniture of the cabinet of the time of Catherine II. Well, in addition to its direct purpose, the study could also be used as a living room. Catherine could rest here and also talk to someone from her entourage. Yes, please come in. Your guest is a little more forward. Well, a magnificent set of gilded furniture is presented in the study. It was made by the French mother Georges Jacob, and Georges Jacob was a critic of the French royal court, as well as other bureaus in Europe, and among the master's customers was also Empress Catherine II. Well, according to tradition, the walls are decorated with portraits. On the left, Elizabeth Petrovna, who is eating a game of clothes in the throne chair, a scepter in her hand. On the right, the hostess and Aunt Catherine II. Ekaterina says that here she is anti-philosophy corresponded with the French canvas educator on terracotta busts. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is on the left and Volt is on the right, and in the center there is a portrait of Ekaterina's son Pavel Petrovich. In this portrait, Pavel is the Grand Duke, but on the right, Pavel is the emperor. Paul became emperor in 1796 year after the sudden death of his mother. At that time Paul was 42 years old, and next to Pavel is a portrait of his wife, Empress Maria Feodorovna, the former Princess of Württemberg, and the next two interiors, dear guests, with whom we will get acquainted with you. The interiors belong to the service premises. This is standard. There will still be a cavalry room ahead, but the name is standard. It is due to the fact that flags and banners of guards regiments were kept here in the 19th century, which guarded the Peterhof residence in the summer. And now, I would like to draw your attention so much in the center. Do you think you caught something? What was it intended for? Yes, that's right. It's a card table, and the tables for playing cards were called Lombardy, after the name of the very popular Spanish card game Lombard. And the table from the historicist collection of the Grand Peterhof Palace was made by the Russian master Nikifor Vasily in the 70s of the 18th century. The table is folding. It has one leg supported by a tabletop. Usually remove them. They are asymmetrical. And the surface of the table is decorated with the so-called technique of the Brand 3 model landscapes. And he collected these landscapes from cups, from the smallest plates, of wood of the most diverse valuable species. That is, he practically used the paint down here. That is, he did not use it at all here, but the cards of the official court fund became about 3 sledges of Anya. Peter the Great, for example, did not like to play Western games. He preferred to play chess, and became even the strongest player of his time. And like his contemporaries, Peter does not spend a day without playing chess or checkers. Another service interior is the Cavalier. Here, dear guests, you can go to the middle. The Cavalier illumination of the wall silk was also called crimson, and was intended for the Cavalier, that's the personal guard of the Empress. Also here, the Cavalier Major Empress complains of the highest officers of the butler regiments. And the paintings are picturesque here too, on a battle theme. These paintings were painted by Flemish, French artists in the 17th-18th century, and the furniture here is displayed magnificently in the first half of the 18th century. The furniture was made by Dutch, German masters, and, as you can see, also fairies in the technique of the Brand 3. The northern walls are decorated with a French-made mirror of the mid-18th century, and the hostess also presents a very interesting grandfather clock. The clock is also 18th century English work. Here is a mahogany case. The cabinets have a pendulum and a clock with complex mechanisms. They show the phase of the moon in addition to time, but you can also see the inscription in the upper part of the dial. The inscription in Latin is of a philosophical and edifying nature, Sica Tuita Hominis, which means such is the life of a person. But the Grand Peterhof Palace has a unique collection of a wide variety of antique clocks. The hours are all working. They are periodically wound up. Unfortunately, it is very rarely done now. A master from the Hermitage comes, winds up the clock, it runs for a while, then it is restored again until his next arrival. When the clock is wound up, of course, they really really enliven the atmosphere of the palace. Well, dear guests, we have practically passed the northern grand suite of the great Peterhof Palace with you. Here you can turn around again and shoot the so-called Golden Suite. And we are now passing from the cavalry room through the small entrance room into the blue living room, and the blue living room completes the northern suite. The door from the blue living room goes to the pre-funeral, but from the pre-funeral in the imperial period, it was possible to go out to the gallery, well, and go to the church of the holy apostles Peter and Paul. In the middle of the 18th century, under the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, the interior of the dining room was called, and now we are talking about the epoch. Elizaveta Petrovna resembles the painting of a Paduga, and in the center of each Paduga you can see a cartouche with the monogram of Elizabeth Petrovna. By the middle of the 18th century, a multi-tiered furnace, lined with ceramic samples of blue, cobalt, red, belongs to the furnace. Such miniature Delilac landscapes, and in the era of Katina E's management, fireplaces become a very important, very fashionable decoration of interiors. There is also a white marble fireplace with a large mirror. A lot of attention was paid to the design of stone shelves. They were placed and candelabra with candles and works, and porcelain or broses, of course also stone clocks. And in the 19th century, the walls of the dining room are decorated with blue silk, and after the interior is redesigned, it is called the Blue Living Room, and for this interior, Emperor Nicholas I ordered a chandelier for 84 candles at the Imperial Farfoni factory, and also ordered Nicholas I large banquet service. The service is called cabbage leaves. As you can see, there is a cabbage leaf on each item from the simple zone, and some of the items are even made in the form of a cabbage leaf, and the service was intended for 250 people, totaled up to 5,500 items. Currently, there are 300 items on display in the week living room, a dining room on a large table, and a dessert room on a round table. Well, you can also see the items of the service in the magnificent cabinets. These are cabinets of French work of the early 19th century. Another Chinese collection of the Great Peterhof Kingdom includes magnificent candelabra of the early 19th century. They were made by the workshop of the Royal Porcelain and Factory. Well, we are going from the blue living room through the White Hall to the southern suite. Lectures and conferences are held in the White Hall, and once there was the personal rest of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, Catherine II, and in the second quarter of the 19th century, here was the so-called Olga half of the palace. That is, there were once 8 rooms here, and the rooms were decorated for the middle daughter of Emperor Nicholas I, Olga, in connection with her wedding to the German Crown Prince Karl of Württemberg. During the post-war restoration of the palace, it was decided to design a concert hall, and we are going with you to the southern suite. Yes, and the southern suite was called the spare half in the 18th century. That is, these rooms are very small, that is, they did not have a specific purpose. Here they could, for example, post-Peterhof residences. And by the way, the exposition is even being formed here in these rooms, and in the first room, dear guests, you can see a portrait of Nicholas I. The portrait was painted by the English artist George Dow. This artist also painted portraits of the heroes of the War of 1819 for the military gallery of the Winter Palace. He painted more than 300 portraits, and the reign of Nicholas I ruled for 30 years from 1825 to 1855 years, and we can say that this time became the golden age in the history of Peterhof. It was the first joke. Peterhof has found its brilliance and scale, but in the summer, the emperor's family lived in the palace cottage, or kotek, as the palace was called, and the palace cottage is located on the territory of the estate of Alexandria. Alexandria is located to the east of the lower Peterhof Park, also on the very shore of the Gulf of Finland. The estate is named in honor of the beloved wife of Nicholas I, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, and in the imperial family there were 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. And these are 2 daughters, the middle Olga, and the younger Alexander, we're going to see. Here we are in the second room. Here is a portrait of Olga's middle daughter. The portrait of Olga was painted by the Scottish artist Christina Roberts, and on the 1st of July, 1846 year, of the Palace Church of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, the wedding of Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna with the German Crown Prince Karl of Württemberg took place. After the wedding, the young couple spent their honeymoon in Peterhof, and then Olga left for her husband's homeland in the Kingdom of Württemberg. On the table you can see part of Olga Nikolaevna's dowry. It's silver tea and coffee service. Of course, with this book, it was very diverse, magnificent. It knocked numerous dining rooms, service sets, furniture fittings, of course, various jewelry. In the third room, the portrait of Alexandra's youngest daughter was also painted by the Scottish artist Christina Robertson, and Alexandra was affectionately called a Deanie in the family. She was a favorite in the family. With her easy nature, kindness, she also had a musical gift. She sang beautifully. She was able to have a very beautiful voice. Soprano, a range that spanned 3 octaves. In this portrait of Alexandra, with such a charming young girl, and a bouquet of cornflowers in her hand. But cornflowers were the favorite flowers of her mother, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, and here I would like to draw your attention, dear guest, to the gnat on the table. What do you think something like that is? Go a little further ahead. No, it's not a samovar.
An egg or something.
And for the string, please, do not bring the handle. Yes, that's all right. It's a clock, a mechanical clock of Russian work of the late 18th century. Here is such an unusual shape. It is made in the form of a domestic vase. The clock is bronze. 2 amal rings rotate with numbers, and the roll of the hour hand, the only one that remains motionless, is performed by the head of a snake with a protruding tongue. Here I told you that it has a great wind, with a unique collection of various solid watches. The last interior of the so-called spare half of the palace is the Junker chamber. And in the Junker's cell, there was a Kammer Junker, or a Kammerfrau on duty, who served the Empress during the divan ritual. The doors from the chamber Junker, as you can guess, dear guests, were in the Empress's dressing room. Well, while the Empress's lady-in-waiting was waiting, she could, for example, do needlework. Here a table with a lot of drawers is presented. But, for example, embroidery or painting decorative stone screens was quite a popular female occupation. Well, such screens were put decorative, so they were not heated. And the last 2 interiors that you and I are going to get acquainted with in the Grand St. Petersburg Palace. These interiors belong to the male half. This is the Emperor's bedchamber, or the second name of the crown, and, of course, the oak study of the founder of Peterhof, Peter the Great. And in the emperor's bedchamber, in the alcove bed, a bed of 18th century German work. Well, you probably noticed that the bed is not very big, because in the 18th century it was customary to sleep half-sitting. It was even considered useful for health. Both sides of the door niche. The door on the right leads to the Empress bedchamber or sofa, but the door on the left is the eye chamber, and next to the eye chamber there is a climbing chair for a chamber pot, and the whole seat is hidden by a pillow. This chair is Italian work of the 18th century, and similar eye chairs were used in the palace up to the second quarter of the 19th century, and only the first one was installed in the palace. A water closet was made, and water supply was also carried out, and in the center there is a magnificent bedchamber table. The table is also Italian work of the 18th century. Here Borrow holds the sphere on our shoulders, as it were, for the winter. The tabletop is decorated with different varieties of marble, and according to legend, there was a crown on a table under a glass hood under Paul I. Not the imperial crown, but the crown of the Order of Malta. Pavel I was the 72nd Grand Master of this oldest knightly order of Malta, and with these from the side of the name, the crown emperor rested. Now the crown of Malta order is also in Moscow, in the armory. And the last interior, dear guest, whom we will meet in our big Peterhof Palace, is the oak study of the founder of the Peterhof residence, Peter the Great. When you enter the office, you will pay attention to the height of the ceiling. The ceiling is significantly lower than in other interiors. Yes, dear guests, here also, please, do not get up too close to it. Do not touch them with handles. Yes, that's why he didn't like large spaces. All of Peter's palaces are very intimate, and the idea of decorating the cabinet with oak panels belonged to the French architect, Jean-Baptiste Leblin. Leblin came from Paris to St. Petersburg, the invitation of Peter the Great. Prior to that, Leblin was the instrument architect of the French king of the 14th ice, and also with Lebel, he came a whole staff of craftsmen, and here are the unique panels. Panels made of solid oak were made, according to the sketches of the French carver and draftsman Nicholas Pinnet. And so in their plots, the language of allegory manifests the provinciatelnaya activity of Peter the Great. And look, those murals that are darker are clearly visible. Here they are authentic. They were saved during the war years, and the lighter ones were recreated by restorers. And it took about 2.5 years to recreate only one other Reno panel. In other words, this is a very time-consuming and very long process. Well, the furniture in the office is also presented in Peter's time. Walnutshka bureau. On the table, the folding center of Peter's decrees, there is also a camping inkwell. And on the left, there is a camping alarm clock. Historians have read that almost out of the 53 years of his life, Peter led 30 of them on campaigns and travels. And he visited more than 30 cities in Europe and about 130 cities in Russia. Before Peter the Great, none of the adults had been a war for so long. And in the center of the cabinet is a Visfer globe. This globe was made by English masters in the 1730s, that is, after the death of Peter the Great. But the globe reminds us that Peter the Great was a very versatile person. He was interested in various sciences, including geography, and he owned 14 crafts. Here, by the way, Nicholas I revered his ancestor, about the great-grandfather of Peter the Great. And every morning he came here from the cottage palace with a large Peterhof charge, and loved to work in Peter's office, and even took to in the cabinet of the minister. And with that, dear guests, we conclude our tour in the Grand Peterhof Palace. Thank you for your attention. Let's go out slowly. We pass through the dressing rooms. Well, as once in these rooms, there were numerous dresses of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. And you and I are going down the stairs now.